Welcome. Today we will uncover the secrets behind the strategic miscalculations and shattered myths about the German army in December 1944. What caused the sudden crisis that paralyzed the power of the Tigers and Panthers, and why did even the most modern equipment become useless without fuel? Imagine, at the start of Operation Watch on the Rhine, German forces assembled over 70 tanks and 5,000 elite soldiers, while at the same time, American warehouses in Honsfeld stored more than 50,000 gallons of high-octane gasoline, exceeding the monthly needs of an entire division. How is such a thing possible? Why did Albert Speer warn of a critical shortage of synthetic fuel in June of the previous year, only for production to drop to minimal levels by September? The United States was extracting over 1 billion barrels of oil, less than 2% of American production, while Germany, weakened by resource shortages, relied on capturing foreign stockpiles. Why did the German command's strategic plan fail due to destructive logistics, while the Allies supplied millions of gallons of fuel daily through pipelines and motor convoys? Could Germany have won the war by ignoring the total fuel shortage and relying solely on resource capture? And what if we say that even the most powerful equipment becomes hopelessly useless without fuel? In this video, we will analyze how logistics determine the outcome of the battle and why every major victory is always supported by a hidden war for resources. Are you ready to see the truth hidden in the archives? Then let's begin. In December 1944, when the shadow of war covered Europe, it seemed that the German army was an invincible machine capable of changing the course of history. During the coldest and darkest days of winter, the strategists of the Third Reich confidently declared, Germany was in a state of strength, its fronts unshakable, and future victories merely a matter of time. But behind this illusion lay a terrible truth that most refused to see, as obvious and undeniable as the fact that the German military machine had begun to break down from within. And the key element of this destruction was not only the shortage of weapons or moral exhaustion, but, most importantly, a critical fuel deficit and weak, decaying logistics which, amid apparent power, became a fatal vulnerability. It was this that shattered the myth of invincibility, this that became the weak link leading to collapse. In December 1944, at the height of the winter campaign, the German army launched an operation that would become one of the boldest and riskiest offensives in the history of World War II. Its name was Watch on the Rhine. The German command, confident in their strength, gathered to strike unexpectedly on the Western Front, in the Ardennes. They had about 77 tanks, nearly 50 half-tracks, and around 5,000 elite SS soldiers. These figures sounded impressive, portrayed as a symbol of power and proof of strategic superiority. But behind these numbers lay a terrible reality. The operation was scheduled for the morning of December 18th at 5:30 a.m., under conditions of complete fuel shortage among the German troops. The timing was unfavorable, resources were at their limit, and the preparation was clearly underestimated. You can imagine the scene. German troops, scattered and exhausted, gathering at dawn in the cold silence. Around them, nothing but the rustling of leaves and the creaking of metal. They could not rely on their supplies, which should have supported their advance. However, strategists believed that captured resources and territories would give them an advantage. But what was their actual fuel reserve? In American warehouses located in Honsfeld, over 50,000 gallons of high-octane aviation gasoline were stored. This was not just a reserve, it exceeded the monthly norm for an entire German division, a testament to the fact that the enemy was overestimating its resources, relying on an illusory wealth that could vanish at any moment. And as soon as the offensive began, it became clear. The German troops had no fuel left to continue fighting. The time when they could have used their own machinery had passed. They found themselves prisoners of their own illusion. The story of this campaign is not only about military tactics or strategic calculations. It is a story of a strategic miscalculation, of misjudging resources, of underestimating the power of logistics. In June 1944, just 6 months before this offensive, General Albert Speer, the chief of armaments, recommended halting all offensive operations. he spoke of a severe shortage of synthetic fuel, which was vital for continuing the fight. Production of this fuel, based on the synthesis of coal and oil, had decreased from 37,000 tons in April to less than 5,000 by September. And these are not just numbers. They are a warning signal. They prove that Germany, despite all efforts, had lost control over its own industry and resources. Over these years, during the war, the leading powers fought for control over natural riches. While the United States extracted over 1 billion barrels of oil annually, Germany produced less than 33 million, less than 2% of American output. The facts showed that economic power and technological progress did not ensure Germany energy independence. They relied on occupied territories and strategic reserves, on the illusion that resources could simply be captured. But in reality, as evidence showed, this strategy was doomed to fail. The American supply system, pipelines delivering tons of oil daily, and the Red Ball Express, a system of trucks and convoys, provided the front with everything necessary. They surpassed German logistics in volume, speed, and reliability. These systems became an invisible but powerful weapon of victory. Now the question arises, could Germany have won the war while ignoring the obvious, undeniable truth, the fuel shortage? Could they have succeeded by betting on capturing American warehouses and resources without realizing that this strategy was nothing more than an illusion? Why did these strategic miscalculations lead to defeat? The answer lies at the very heart of this story. It is not only about military equipment or tactics, but about the fundamental power of logistics, which determines the outcome of any battle. Could the strength of tanks or the number of troops matter if there was no fuel? Could a resource acquisition strategy compensate for the fuel shortage if the logistics itself was weak and decayed? These questions remain unanswered definitively because the facts show even the most modern equipment becomes useless without fuel. Logistics is not only an unseen force, it is the invisible hero that determines victory or defeat. And in this lies a lesson that remains relevant today. In the dark corridors of history, where the fates of millions are decided not on battlefields but behind factory walls and within the heart of industrial secrets, one of the most vulnerable points of any military machine is hidden: fuel. The war raging across Europe, especially during the offensive known as the Battle of the Bulge, vividly demonstrated how a strategic resource, oil and its derivatives, can become a decisive factor in the outcome of battles. In this context, the scale and consequences of the fuel crisis for the German army are revealed as an invisible but powerful force, undermining even the most hardened and well-prepared troops. And it is precisely here, in this dark depth, that our investigation begins, showing that victory in war is achieved not only on the front lines, but also in the rear, in the heart of industry and logistics. The production of synthetic fuel in Germany during those years was supposed to be one of the pillars of national defense, but reality proved far harsher. At the beginning of 1944, German factories and hydrogenation plants operated at relatively high capacities, about 17,500 tons of synthetic fuel per month. This figure created the illusion that Germany could supply its army and industry with enough fuel to continue the war. However, by autumn of the same year, the situation had changed dramatically. Production had shrunk to a few thousand tons, less than 5,000, a catastrophe for military logistics, a disaster that quietly but inexorably undermined the foundations of German military power. The hydrogenation plants were operating at less than 10% of their capacity. What could have caused such a collapse? Technical failures? Obsolete equipment? Or perhaps strategic weakening of industry caused by Allied bombings? All of this together created a concentrated effect that was hard to ignore. Meanwhile, on a global scale, the situation with oil was even more dramatic. The Allies, the United States and their allies, extracted billions of barrels of oil annually. While American production reached inexplicably high levels for Germany, over 1.5 billion barrels, Germany remained in the shadows. Its output did not exceed 33 million barrels per year. This gap in resources could not help but affect the combat effectiveness of the German army, especially in a situation where all operations required colossal fuel expenditures. For an offensive operation in the Ardennes, which was to be the final major blow, at least 4.5 million gallons of fuel were needed. Despite allocating 5 million gallons, only half of that was delivered to the front. Transportation problems, outdated roads, destroyed railways, lack of modern delivery means, turned logistics into a real nightmare. The German army, which was supposed to advance, faced harsh realities. While the Allies developed a network of pipelines, motor columns, and warehouses, ensuring daily supplies of millions of gallons of fuel, the Germans had to rely on outdated methods. Horse-drawn wagons, old trucks used since World War I. All of this became their reality. As the Allies built new infrastructure chains, German troops fought for every drop of fuel. By December 1944, American forces consumed up to 7.5 million gallons of fuel daily. Their reserves reached 8.5 million. They accumulated resources, creating a strategic reserve that could become a decisive factor at any critical moment. German units, such as the Tigers and Panthers, used 2.5 and 1.5 gallons per mile, respectively. But during the Battle of the Bulge, fuel consumption increased by 40%. These were not just numbers. They reflected the growing wear and tear of equipment, crew fatigue, and most importantly, despair. The most vivid evidence of the crisis was the attacks by American aircraft. During the offensive intended to break German resistance, American bombers and fighters destroyed fuel depots, paralyzing German supply lines. Every bomb dropped on fuel warehouses was a blow to combat capability, to the ability to continue fighting. Unquestionable evidence shows that the destruction of German depots became one of the key factors undermining their logistical system. As a result, even with combat-ready troops, weapons, and equipment, they were almost useless without fuel. And within this mechanism, this chain, lies the main conflict: how the fuel shortage, caused by the destruction of German industrial capacities, predetermined the outcome of German offensives and accelerated their failure. This analysis shows that war is not only about heroic battles and strategic tricks on the battlefield. War is a struggle for resources. Fuel is the blood of the machine, without which it comes to a halt. Understanding the scale of this resource is the key to comprehending why the German army, despite heroism and power, was doomed. It's not just about tactics and strategy. It's about industrial strength, about a country's ability to supply its army with everything necessary. Only then does it become clear. Victory in war is won not only on the front lines, but also in the heart of industry, in logistical chains that sustain the army's combat readiness. Therefore, the scale of fuel is not just numbers or statistics. It is an invisible but powerful factor capable of determining the course of history. This is the main lesson. In war, victory depends not only on the strength of weapons, but also on the ability to supply them with fuel. This is the true cost of victory. In the mists of history, where the fates of millions are decided not on battlefields, but in the silence of command bunkers and behind the scenes of logistical schemes, lies one of the most powerful and invisible arteries of war. Where weapons and soldiers are only the tip of the iceberg, it is the supply systems, fuel deliveries, and continuous cargo movement that determine the outcome of battles. In this story, in this struggle for every drop of fuel and every reserve unit, unfolds the astonishing strategy of the Allies, which surpassed all expectations and turned logistics into a weapon as powerful as artillery and aviation. The long months of war, immersed in chaos and destruction, were simultaneously a fight for resources. Recognizing that without a continuous flow of oil and fuel their mechanisms would collapse, the Allies began to create an invisible network to ensure their victory. And this network started forming long before the decisive battles off the western coasts of Europe. One of the first and most vital elements was the pipeline system laid across the English Channel, like blood vessels connecting Britain with continental Europe. These pipes, hidden beneath the sea surface, supplied up to 1 million gallons of oil daily. Their length, power, and reliability became a symbol of the Allies' strategic foresight. The facts show it was not just an engineering feat, but a true war for energy that could decide the outcome of the entire campaign. But despite technological achievements, logistics require not only equipment, but also human resources, strict organization, and coordinated work. In the midst of the fiercest battle for control over every liter of fuel, the Allied commanders created a system that entered history as the Red Ball Express. At its core were 6,000 trucks moving day and night, an invisible flow unmatched in its scale. They delivered 12,500 tons of cargo daily, and each truck was not just a machine, it was a living part of the mechanism, consuming 40 gallons of fuel per day. These figures are not merely indicators of scale. They reflect the hidden battle for logistical continuity that kept the front moving despite destruction and enemy attacks. A crucial role in supporting the front was played by the reserves accumulated in December 1944. At that time, Allied forces had about 3.5 million gallons of fuel in reserve. This was not just a number, it was a fortress that provided them with strategic superiority. When the German army, exhausted and worn out, was trying to find a weak spot for a counterattack, the Allies already had the capability to hold the line and strike without fear of supply disruptions. Such fuel power became the foundation of their operational advantage, enabling them not only to maintain the front, but also to plan further offensives. Ensuring such large-scale supplies was impossible without a system that united hundreds of freight companies and pipeline structures, more than 230 in total. These nodes and pipelines delivered tens of millions of gallons of oil daily, creating a continuous flow that knew no stop. Behind them, work was bustling. Engineers, logisticians, commanders, all working as one organism. There was no room for mistakes in this giant mechanism, as its cohesion determined the fate of millions. And finally, one of the most ambitious operations was the so-called Pluto. It was not just a project, it was a true lifeline that connected Britain with France. Every day, a flow of 1 million gallons of oil passed through it. Time was both an enemy and an ally, as each drop delivered along this pipeline strengthened the Allies' positions, making a German offensive increasingly impossible. Indeed, throughout the month, Allied air operations used more fuel than the German army had during the entire war. P-47 aircraft, powerful machines tearing through the sky with a roar, consumed 300 gallons of fuel per hour. These were not just numbers, they were a testament to how intense and saturated this war was, where every drop of fuel mattered. And all of this was not only about technological achievements or logistical schemes, it was about a strategy that became the cornerstone of victory. Accumulated reserves, continuous supplies, complex operations, all created such power that they made a German offensive impossible. In a war that was becoming increasingly exhausting and where the enemy was growing more ruthless, these systems provided the Allies with strategic superiority. What is the main lesson of this story? How did the development and use of logistics systems, as invisible yet very real fronts, determine victory? The answer is obvious. Success is not always determined solely by military tricks or heroism on the front lines. The war is won where it is least visible, in logistical shadows, in precise calculations, in impeccable supply organization, and in the ability to use every drop of energy to achieve the final goal. And if we speak of the most important aspect, it is precisely in this that the strength lies, namely, in the system that became an integral part of victory, no less important than guns and infantry. Effective logistics is not just an auxiliary element, it is the front where the outcome of the war and the fate of millions are decided. On that cold December day, when the silence of the winter morning was broken only by the rare sounds of approaching wheels and the clatter of tires, an operation began that was destined to change the course of the war. Its name was the Battle of the Ardennes Offensive, but its fate was already sealed at the very moment when Germany, wielding the weapon of a powerful military machine, faced an insurmountable obstacle: its own logistics. It was impossible not to notice that on the eve of this offensive, deep within the German command headquarters, like a shadow, there hovered a single thought: they did not have enough fuel. And despite all plans, calculations, and strategic intricacies, it was precisely the shortage of fuel that became their fatal enemy. The day this operation began, December 22nd, 1944, marked a turning point. At that moment, according to documents, German forces had only 70% of the minimum fuel reserve needed for a full-scale offensive. This meant that the army, which believed in its strength and invincibility, was already operating on a dangerously thin margin from the very beginning. Dozens of divisions, hundreds of tanks, and thousands of soldiers ready for battle found themselves in a critical situation. Their engines could get stuck in the snow, and their combat vehicles could not cover even half of the planned distance. This fact, not just a number in reports, was a harbinger of the catastrophe that was already beginning. In the first days of the operation, when German troops launched their offensive, their successes seemed illusory. The captured depots in Honsfeld and Stavalo stored millions of gallons of fuel, which appeared to guarantee their victory. But these riches, as if under the influence of a malevolent fate, were quickly destroyed. Explosions, fires, enemy bombings, all turned the supplies into ashes. Fuel disappeared faster than it could be used. German equipment, proud of its power, heavy Tigers and swift Panthers, consumed 2.5 and 1.5 gallons per mile. In the Ardennes, their consumption increased by almost 40%, which in conditions of limited reserves meant only one thing: each mile required more and more resources, and less remained. Against this backdrop, even the most prepared German troops, such as the 15th Panzer Army, found themselves in a critical situation. At the start of the offensive, they had only 300 liters of fuel. Not enough for a short operation, not enough for more than a few hours of combat. It was not just a small amount, it was catastrophically insufficient. Under these conditions, when intelligence and intercepted radio communications from the Americans showed that the enemy was already aware of the situation, it became clear: the Germans' chances of success were melting away with each hour. Indeed, in the first days of the attack, as columns of German equipment pushed through forests and snow, having used up 40% of their fuel, they had covered only 20 miles. This distance, which seemed insignificant, became their limit. All their strength, all their machinery, came to a halt. Why? The answer lies in a simple but deadly truth: there was not enough fuel. Documents, witnesses, intelligence reports, all evidence is irrefutable. The Germans were doomed precisely because of this seemingly minor detail: a fuel shortage. Their tanks, trucks, and aircraft all stopped because, beyond the technical aspect, the fate of logistics was at stake, which in war becomes no less important than the fighting itself. For American intelligence and radio intercepts, it was clear: the German forces were in a critical situation. They heard commanders, in despair, discussing the impossibility of continuing the offensive, how their engines were suffocating and dying out, how fuel supplies were vanishing before their eyes. Reports and intelligence data indicated that the Germans were fighting not only the enemy, but also their own era, an era in which logistics had become their own death sentence. By December 22, Peiper, the commander of the German forces, had only about 1,000 gallons of fuel left, more than enough for a few days of combat. The encircled groups had only 8,000 gallons, which was essentially a drop in the ocean of their needs. Under such conditions, continuing the offensive was impossible. It was like trying to swim against the current, knowing that strength was running out, and each new step was a risk hiding death. The main question hanging over this entire story is: why did the resource acquisition strategy prove to be doomed? Why, even with reserves that seemed more than sufficient, couldn't German commanders foresee that their own supplies would become their weak point? And how did the fuel shortage halt their advance, turning them into puppets of their own disorganization and inability to supply their machinery with the necessary fuel? The answer lies in the very essence of war: in people, in plans, in logistics, which in decisive moments often turn out to be the decisive factor. And in this lies their tragedy, their fatal mistake, underestimating the importance of supply. And so, when it seemed that all was lost, that German tanks and soldiers were only shadows of their former might, suddenly came the realization. Logistics is not just preparation, not just supply. It is the death of any military campaign. And in December 1944, she literally stopped the German tanks. This is the whole truth. This is the essence of the tragedy that determined the outcome of the battle and which cannot be forgotten. Because ultimately, war is not only heroic battles. It is primarily the ability to supply your forces with resources. And if this is not done, all victories are in vain. In the dark depths of World War II history, there are many episodes that seem hidden behind walls of oblivion. But it was precisely they that determined the fates of fronts, the fates of nations, and ultimately, the outcome of the entire struggle. One such key moment was the fight for control over fuel resources, a battle that took place not on the battlefield, but in the air, in the rear, at the heart of strategic operations. Today we will delve into that era, when every gallon of burned fuel was not just fire but a symbol of destruction, a power capable of changing the course of the war. The scale of the fuel destruction operations was staggering. During powerful air raids, sorties, and sabotage missions, the Allies eliminated more than 8 million gallons of fuel, an enormous amount that left its mark not only on warehouses and production bases, but on the entire enemy's strategic infrastructure. Imagine thousands of aircraft soaring into the dark night skies, hundreds of kilometers from the front. Their target was not the land, not the enemy in armor and steel, but countless tanks, warehouses, and reservoirs filled with the most valuable resource of the war. Fires erupted, fiery columns reflected in the dark sky, all to deprive the Germans of the ability to continue fighting. And these actions had their dramatic consequences. In the very first week of the operation, the Allies destroyed more fuel than Germany could produce in an entire month. This fact is astonishing. It was like a thunderclap in the clear sky for the German army, which still hoped in its strength and technological achievements. Within a few days, warehouses and motor convoys supplying the German front were reduced to ruins. Every barrel, every tank, every abandoned or destroyed cistern was part of a large-scale struggle for a vital resource. But the fight for fuel was not only about destroying warehouses. A crucial part of the Allies' strategy was controlling the transportation system that delivered millions of gallons of fuel daily to the front lines. Pipelines, motor convoys, steamships, all formed an invulnerable supply network capable of supporting even the most distant and hard-to-reach sectors of the front. Under normal conditions, this system seemed unbreakable, continuous, and it became a weapon capable of depriving the enemy of his strength. Especially illustrative in this context are the events of December 1944. At that time, American aviation conducted over 2,000 combat sorties in a single day. Every aircraft, every flame, every explosion, all of it was part of a large-scale campaign to burn fuel. And here, the key was not only the number of sorties but also the speed. Allied aircraft burned fuel faster than Germany could extract or produce it synthetically. In a situation where German industry was experiencing a severe raw material shortage and attempts to synthesize fuel faced technological and resource limitations, this strategy turned into a nightmare for German commanders. It was not a matter of chance or luck. It was a carefully planned strategy that transformed air raids into weapons of mass destruction, not only for armaments, but also for the very essence of the German war machine. As a result, equipment that was once considered invincible, Tigers and Panthers, found itself in a position where there was no longer enough fuel for them. They became increasingly vulnerable, their engines stalled, and many of these combat vehicles were left immobile, combat ineffective, with no chance to continue fighting. While the Allies strengthened their positions, the Germans had to watch as their power melted away, their equipment became useless, and the war turned into a war of attrition. Key German positions in the Ardennes, such as La Roche, were not just points on the map. They symbolize the Germans' last attempts to counterattack, hold strategic heights, and break through the Allied defenses. But it was precisely there, amid fuel shortages, that German equipment became inoperable. Machines could no longer move, soldiers could not maneuver, and the tactical superiority that once seemed unquestionable disappeared amid the flames of burnt tanks and fuel tanks. As a result, these critical positions were either destroyed or captured. This marked the final act in a series of defeats that accelerated the ultimate collapse of German resistance. German commanders, in their diaries and reports, acknowledged they suffered defeat not only due to numerical superiority and tactical errors, but also because their strategic plans failed amid a severe fuel shortage. These words sounded like a verdict, confirming that resource superiority and control over it were no less important than any combat technology. The time and evidence gathered during this period show that a war of attrition, a war for resources, became a key factor determining the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge, and ultimately, the entire war. So how did the destruction and control of fuel resources become decisive in the Allies' final victory? Why did this factor turn out to be so crucial that the entire front strategy boiled down to fighting for every drop? The answer lies in the fact that war is not only about weapons and tactics. War is resources, supply chains that connect the front and the rear. And if these chains are broken, if the enemy is deprived of the ability to sustain its equipment and troops, its forces dwindle and its capabilities vanish. The history of the Battle of the Bulge is not just a story of a fight over hills and forests. It is a story of how control over resources determined the outcome of the battle. This lesson teaches that victory in war is not only about strategy, heroism of soldiers, or superior weaponry. Above all, it is about control over resources, without which no army can sustain itself for long. It was this very struggle, for fuel, for life and death, for the future, that made the Allies' victory impossible for the enemy. Ultimately, war is not just a battle on the battlefield. War is a war for resources, and the Battle of the Bulge clearly demonstrated that control over fuel is the key to victory. In an era when war became not only a clash of weapons and strategies, but also a war of resources, American abundance of fuel and material resources became the newest weapon, supporting the front lines and destroying enemy morale. German prisoners and commanders, caught in the grip of this new reality, faced for the first time the scale of American wealth. Their eyes, accustomed to limited supplies, sparse provisions, and constant underfeeding, were stunned. In their memories, and in stories told under torture or in the silence of night barracks, words full of bewilderment and fear could be heard. They saw Americans using gasoline and fuel, thousands of gallons, not for manufacturing weapons or equipment, but for destruction. They observed massive tanks and aircraft, like living monsters, consuming miles of fuel, leaving behind only blazing ruins. This fact, not just a number, not just logistics, became a symbol of their defeat. The Germans understood. Their own weakness was revealed in the lack of resources, and they were unable to compete in logistics. At the heart of their command, especially in the mind of Field Marshal Model, a realization took root. The war was already lost, even if fighting continued. Lost in logistics, in supplies, in the ability to sustain the front. This thought, like poison, seeped into every cell of their consciousness. Evidence of this was found in letters and reports from soldiers and officers. These revealed not only anxiety and despair, but also fear. Fear of hopelessness, of the possibility that all efforts might be in vain because the enemy possessed what they did not. The Americans burned millions of gallons of fuel, turning it into flames and smoke, and this was perceived by German military leaders as proof of their own weakness. Their defeat was not only in battle, but also in logistical incapacity to sustain their army. While the Americans used their resources to destroy the enemy, the Germans watched their own supplies vanish like water in the desert. This psychological trauma became especially acute at the end of the war, when resources were rapidly exhausted. During the Nuremberg trials, as one of the most vivid symbols of legal and moral judgment, German leaders repeatedly returned to the theme of logistics. They called it the decisive factor in defeat. In their testimonies, in their defenses and accusations, one idea was clear. Without sufficient resources, victory is impossible. In the years when the German army could no longer redeploy troops, when tanks and airplanes remained idle due to fuel shortages, American forces, like chess pieces on a board, moved across Europe and the Pacific theater, capturing cities and strategic points. Their movements seemed endless, unstoppable. The anniversaries of 1944 and 1945 were remembered precisely for this, the inability to halt the flow of the enemy's resources. At that moment, when it appears that weaponry and technology determine the outcome of the battle, it becomes clear that what is far more important is the ability to supply them with necessary resources. This is the main lesson. In modern warfare, victory often depends not only on the strength of weapons, but also on the capacity to provide them with resources. The scale of American abundance and logistical power proved to be not just statistics, but psychological weapons that undermine the confidence and fighting spirit of German soldiers. Accustomed to strict discipline and harsh combat, they faced an invisible enemy, an unlimited reserve of fuel, which became a symbol of their vulnerability, their weakness. This is the root of their defeat. This is the reason why, even after losing on the battlefield, the defeat in the enemy's consciousness was already predetermined. Could morale and faith in their strength withstand the scale of American abundance and logistical might? This question remains open because history shows that victory in war is often determined not only by tactical and strategic decisions, but also by the ability to supply one's army with resources that transform them into an invincible force. Even if this force seems invisible, it is the foundation on which victory or defeat is built. The history of American fuel supplies is not just a story about resources. It is a story about how modern warfare becomes a battle for survival in a world where victory depends not only on weapons, but also on the ability to supply them. And within this lies the key. In an era when resources determine the outcome of battles, victory belongs to those who know how to extract, store, and use them. Deep within the history of armed conflicts, woven into their strategies and tactics, there is one unglamorous but critically important factor that often remains unnoticed by the untrained eye. It is control over resources, especially oil and metals. The fate of wars, particularly grand and large-scale ones, is largely determined by these factors. They are the invisible but mighty force capable of turning the course of events, destroying or strengthening states, making victory a reality or condemning to defeat. And it is precisely in the story of the fuel crisis, its lessons and consequences, that the key to understanding victory and defeat in modern war is hidden. The production of oil and metals is not just about numbers and indicators. It is the core, the heart of any military machine. Without fuel, it is impossible to keep tanks, airplanes, and ships operational. Without metals, it is impossible to build weapons or create armor. Control over these resources is control over the viability of the army, its combat capability, and ultimately, its survival. During World War II, when the battle for resources flared up on every front, this truth became evident. Harsh scenes unfolded before our eyes. Allied bombings of oil refineries, German raids on strategic targets, the efforts of various sides to seize oil fields to prevent the enemy from making a final push. But what was truly decisive? The answer is simple: control over oil. It determines strategic strength, durability, and ultimately the outcome of the entire war. American industrial power, in turn, became the leitmotif of victory. During the years when Europe was ravaged by war and bombings, the United States, like an impregnable fortress, produced about 2 billion barrels of oil annually. This was an undeniable fact. The American economy and military industry possessed absolute superiority, unattainable for Germany, which, in wartime, fought for every ton of fuel and metal. While Germany, torn apart by internal contradictions and limited resources, could not supply its armies with enough fuel to sustain offensive operations, the Americans relentlessly pumped their factories, tanks, and aircraft. Their industrial machine operated around the clock, without restrictions. Every day, every minute, millions of gallons of oil were transformed into combat power capable of moving the front, destroying the enemy, and strengthening positions. American industry became the cornerstone of victory, a symbol of power capable of consuming millions of gallons of fuel without fear or limitation because it had an endless supply of resources. But what was happening on the fronts? In 1944, when the Allied advance reached its peak, despite incredible efforts, German troops could not resist fully. Their army, packed with equipment and manpower, was dependent on logistics, and it was precisely a logistical failure that became their death sentence. The war turned into a battle not only for territory, but also for fuel supplies, transportation routes, and control over oil refineries. Operations such as Road Watch or the Battle of the Bulge demonstrated, without fuel, even the most powerful tank or well-trained infantry turn into useless piles of metal. Without fuel, they cannot move, cannot fire, cannot perform their combat tasks. All the power of their weapons becomes useless if they are not supplied with the necessary fuel. This was the truth. War is primarily a struggle for resources, for industrial capacity, for the ability to supply one's fighters with everything needed so they can fight. This is the main lesson. War becomes less about skill or bravery of soldiers and more about industrial power, the ability to produce weapons, logistics, and control over resources. The victory of the American industrial machine demonstrates that in the modern world, where technology and materials determine the outcome of conflicts, a country's capacity to supply its troops with everything they need is its true strength. And this is not only in military terms. It is the strategic foundation of victory. The more resources a country has, and the better it controls them, the higher its chances of success. This lesson remains relevant today. In the 21st century, when wars are fought not only on front lines, but also in cyberspace, in the economic sphere, and in information warfare, resource control remains paramount. Countries with strategic reserves and the ability to supply their industry and military are at an advantage. Strategic reserves of oil and metals, technological independence, control over key supplies, these all determine the outcome of conflicts today. The story about fuel is not just a tale of the past. It is a story of industry triumphing over tactics, a lesson that applies to any war, whether global or local. At the core of any confrontation lies the desire to control resources, and this factor can change the fate of any nation. Can one win a war without industrial superiority? This question remains relevant to this day. Logistics, transportation, supplies. These are what determine the outcome of hostilities today. The story about fuel shows that without powerful manufacturing capabilities, even the boldest and most decisive plans are doomed to fail. In the modern world, victory is achieved not only through tactics or troop numbers, but also through the ability to supply them with everything necessary. And when it comes to the 21st century, resource control has become what separates winners from losers. Because as history shows, even the most advanced technologies are useless without fuel and metals, mere fragile metal and useless parts. The story about fuel is a story of industry triumphing over tactics, a lesson that remains relevant in any war. Whether it is a global conflict or a local war, one factor remains unchanged: resource control. It is the key to victory or defeat. And if the question is about strategic victory, the answer is always the same: control over production capacities, logistics, and resources. This is the main lesson of the story about fuel, a lesson that will never lose its relevance. Because ultimately, victory is not just about fighting, it is about controlling resources, the ability to supply your fighters with everything they need to win. As experience shows, without fuel and metals, even the most powerful armies turn into useless metal.